This conference will now be recorded.
Well, welcome everybody to the July 8th monthly data usability workgroup meeting. We have a wonderful agenda today. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Comita to cover the first part of the slides. These are available already online for you, so if you'd like to download your own copy, you can do so from the website. I'll be chatting the links and some of that while Dr. Comita is presenting. So with that, David, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and welcome everyone, and thanks for coming into our summer session here. Hope everyone is enjoying the session, as Dee Dee said, and was able to have some time over the long weekend. So we'll dive in here. Really, the overall agenda is go over, for those who may be joining for the first time, or as we do have a very large membership list, and there are people who drop in. Not everybody's on every call, so for the benefit of those who are dropping in and not orienting themselves to some of the logistics, we'll go over that, and really focus today on the output of the topics. Really focusing on the data provenance and traceability of changes. And we'll tie that to our clinician work group that we had in the discussion there, and then go over the use case summaries with scenarios that will be used to develop the IG for that. And then have a discussion about our collaboration space and the input that's there. And then the IG guide structure and development process for our phase 2. And we'll go from there. Next slide. So again, this is just to highlight that we have a lot of organizations, a lot of participants across the industry represented on this group, and appreciate everybody's expertise in providing input to this important effort. And as usual, and always, we encourage you to invite other colleagues for our future discussions. This work group is open to all participants, and thank everybody for your continued support on this effort. And the next 3 slides, or next 2 slides, are really just highlighting that we could not do this without the support of the Sequoia project members. And that really enables us to host this work group and all of the interoperability matters efforts going on. So thank you to all the membership on these next few slides. And then in terms of, for again, those who may be joining us for the first time or haven't been back, to orient the lay of the land here, we're invite and encourage everyone to join us for our ongoing phase 2 efforts. Again, the meetings are held once per month, and it's the second Thursday of each month. And if you find your way to the website, you can register for the work group if you have not done so. Everything is pretty much self-serve, with the calendar downloads, the meeting notes, and for your reference for future meetings. And the agenda items and slides are published prior to the meeting and then put on the website for download as well. So all that you need at your fingertips there at the self-serve website. And the next slide. Just also really want to highlight this link here. You'll find the data usability workgroup forum, and that's really our asynchronous collaboration space. And this will be utilized heavily between the meetings, as we're now only meeting monthly to gather the input as necessary. We'll reply as additional questions arise. And emails will be pushed when input is required by the workgroup members. So we really do encourage engagement here. And this is really going to be the meat of our asynchronous work that we'll bring back and coordinate in our in-person meetings or live meetings. As you just the lay of the land, you can click the topic to open the response window, enter your name and email and free-form text and type in anything you want. And there's an example here on the slide for you to look at. You can just please, again, your attention to visit and respond to the questions that are currently on the forum. And there's been significant activity, so we really do appreciate everybody's attention and collaboration in the forum. And with that, I will hand it over to Dee Dee to facilitate the ongoing discussion for our provenance topic. I'm sorry, Dee Dee, are you still there on audio?
Oh, I was talking to mute. I'm sorry, I had myself double muted. Thank you. I was talking away. Well, thank you again, David, for that overview. And what I was saying, and before I was told that you couldn't hear me, was that what we're going to try to attempt to do in today's meeting is show you the cadence and kind of the process that we're going to use internally. So in addition to Dr. Comita and Dr. Gregg, we do have in-kind services being provided by Russell Bryant and John Vining from Epic. So it's kind of the core internal team. So when I talk about Sequoia staff and volunteers, that's kind of who it is, as well as Shauna Hembry, Amelia Dahl, who's on this phone. So there's several of us that are all working behind the scenes to make, to bring this to you. But just for full disclosure, this is kind of what we're going to try to do for each of the various topic areas. So we're going to start today's meeting with one of the 8 topic categories that were found in the priority spreadsheet, which is the second link that I provided in the chat window just a few moments ago. The provenance topic, provenance and traceability of data. If you open that link, you can find all the information that's the backup of some of the summary. What we've tried to do is put together a straw man of all the findings, all the information that's been gathered from various inputs, so that you can kind of follow along before we start fully writing the implementation guide. But we've already put together a straw man, and this is the data that's going to be put into it from the provenance perspective. But there are still some outstanding questions that we want to socialize with you here on these monthly calls to get you thinking and help provide that input, either through the collaboration forum space that David just helped to demonstrate to you, via emails directly to interoperability or interop matters, which is on the last slide. There's a link to interop matters at sequoiaproject.org. We can take any information from email, from the collaboration space, pick up a phone call and call us if you'd like, however you'd like to get us the input. But what we're going to try to attempt to do is socialize with you what our thinking is, so we can get any course corrections and so forth as we need. So we're going to start off with the clinician workshop. Just as a reminder for those who may not be aware, we did hold a clinician workshop on June 1st. And the recap of it is basically this slide. This is the key facts and elements that were pulled out from the discussions during that workshop that we wanted to make sure were captured, but also our plan is to try to see how we can address these, both from a implementation guide with guidance perspective, but also adding some of the more technical components so implementers, developers can actually deploy them. So just kind of to ground us, just like we did with the workshop, to mention up front, provenance from the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability's perspective, right now, and even with the draft version 2 that has not been formally adopted, but there have been recommendations made by the HITAC committee to ONC for that. Provenance right now in the U.S. CDI covers these 2 data classes under provenance: author, organization, and author timestamp. If you think about it from a CDA document perspective, you're going to have that information for the document one time. But the sections or the entries that maybe FHIR components are made up of in the future may have individual provenance attributes added to them for sections, like an allergy section or a problem section or medication section, et cetera. And also the thinking about the timestamp of when that data was captured, because you may be pulling data from different sources into maybe a snapshot, a CCD document, for instance. So thinking about provenance and how USCDI relates it, right now there are 18 data classes, and the expectation is to at least be able to have the provenance for that. So that's the expectation the industry is going to have from a regulation perspective. But the clinicians, in talking to them at the workshop, really had the expectation for, they want to know where the data originated, which is the author organization, but also in green text here, what type of clinician actually captured it. Was it a pharmacist? Was it a medical doctor? Was it a nurse practitioner? Was it the patient themselves? Who collected the data that they're looking at? And that's not something that's in scope right now. So that is something that we may want to make sure that we provide wonderful guidance and then hopefully inform future USCDI versions and other specifications that other standard organizations publish. But what type of clinician is one of the new components that all the clinicians did feel would be useful to gather. Provenance, if you think about the context of how it was captured and the last touch of who altered that data last, is also nice to have. And I'll describe those in the bullet points below in just a moment. But was the data captured by a patient, a nurse, a physician, home health, a device itself? So that's what type of clinician. And one of the things I'd love for any input or suggestions from the work group members is, are there any vocabularies that anyone knows of already that can be leveraged for type of clinician? I have some things in mind, but they're not necessarily all inclusive. So what do we want to consider? So that's one of the open questions as we start adding the guidance to the implementation guide around what type of clinician, where appropriate. It may be that we only do that for specific data elements to start with, so we kind of create a concept. Maybe we only get type of clinician for specific things, like maybe labs. Where was it captured in? Was it a CLIA lab, and was it a lab tech, or was it done by the physician or a home health nurse? If there was a blood pressure captured or something to that effect. Other things kind of going down the list a little bit more quickly, was the lab result generated with a home test, or was it an over-counter test? Because a lab could be lots of things, pregnancy and other things like that are over-counter elements may be informative. Was a CLIA certified lab where this lab data captured? So those were things that the clinicians as part of the workshop actually kind of teased out in their discussions to us. Was it modified by anybody? Was it modified by the patient and their PHR? There were some concerns, and we'll get into it in a few moments, but one of their concerns was, has it been altered by a patient because they didn't like the information? Hopefully those things can't happen in apps, but those are types of things that people want to maybe have digital credentials where things are signed. So a clinician would sign that they ordered this, or that they reviewed this radiology report, or that this medication order was from this signed physician, and the medication was dispensed by this pharmacist. Thinking about problem data elements, so the problems a patient has as they traverse, those are going to be things that change quite often, because problems, we all are patients and we all have our ups and downs with different encounters. So we do expect change to happen more often for that, but it was talked about in the clinician workshop that labs probably wouldn't change if they came from a blood lab or a pathology lab. Those are not likely going to be changeable elements. So thinking about what type of data may change and what might not. There is a hope by many of the clinicians that provenance will help with some of the deduplication efforts, which is one of our other topic categories. So there is a symbiotic relationship between provenance and deduplication, and we'll see how we tease that out. But most importantly, metadata should not be distracting. It should not get in the way of core clinical data. So there's been some things happening at places like HL7 where they're looking at designing a style sheet where they'll distribute with the standard, and so hopefully vendors will adopt, some of the best practice guidance style sheets where you hover over a field and it'll pop up who captured it, rather than cluttering up your screen with that additional data, as one example. Not to say that that's what we're going to point to, but just know that those are the creative type things that we may consider. So next slide, please. Any questions on the clinician workshop before I start focusing on kind of the meat of it a bit more? Hearing silence. I will continue then. So under that provenance traceability, so data provenance and traceability of changes is the official topic name on that spreadsheet that you have the link in the chat window for. There are two proposals that were sent in as pain points during our phase 1 activities: guidance for data provenance and the consequential data update. So those two on these slides, if you download them online and they're already out there, you can go and click on those links and they'll take you directly to those individual Word Google documents, which are all linked in that spreadsheet. So we tried to include the breadcrumbs there, but reviewing both of those, one of the things that we wanted to highlight is that we do have an HL standard implementation guide known as Basic Provenance. And in that guide, it does address 3 use cases: basic exchange of information, something going through a health information exchange being redistributed. It may be transformed by HIE. We have, for instance, we have several health information exchanges and implementers that work with Diameter Health. As an example, and they transform data, they normalize data, so that if you're not LOINC coding something, they take and add the LOINC codes to it for you. So it may come from a hospital one way, but come out of an HIE improved or changed. And then clinical information reconciliation and incorporation. So those are the 3 basic use cases that IG covers, and so we're going to make sure that we leverage the guidance from that implementation guide to further disseminate in our implementation guide kind of different ways of looking at usability of data. So, and I give credit to Russell and John for coming up and brainstorming with this, and basically definitions of, is it human usable? How can we structure the data to make it more useful, readable, interpretable for the end user in general? And what situations are the most important for receiving that updated data? So as you saw in the clinician workshop, there's some of those things that were provided as input that we need to make sure we consider. From a machine usability perspective, how can we make sure the data is sent out so that the machines can semantically import that, display it, parse it, sort it, index it, display it, and so forth. And then interorganizational usability, which is how do you send the data in a way so that the receiving party really interprets and derives the value, so they don't have 100 pages worth of documents because of all the provenance stuff that has to be added to make them very long, but yet trying to make sure that you're giving just the right information at the right place at the right time. But the questions that were on the forum site are the ones listed here in green. So literally, these are the questions we wanted input for, and we did send out a push email to all the workgroup members, and we did have 2 folks, and we are very grateful for the 2 that took the time to provide some input. We'll highlight on those in a few moments, but these are the questions we're really looking for additional input from you. So if you have not already responded to the forum, it's still not too late. We are still working. We will continue working on this implementation guide through November, December timeframe of this year. So please, if you haven't already and you have a strong opinion or some data you want to contribute, please go out there and list, go out and provide us some input. Next slide, please. Then we're going to take, so thinking about human usability and machine usability and and so forth, we also want to look at it from the viewpoint or viewfinder, slicing and dicing the data, so to speak, by our various use cases. So remember, our charter does state that we are supposed to pull together an implementation guide that will cover provider-to-provider exchange, provider-to-public health, and healthcare entity to consumer. So we are going to pull that information together, and we've already, thanks to all the brainstorming we did from October through April of this year, so October 2020 through April 2021, we gathered a lot of information, and we're very grateful that all of you provided a lot of information. We started trying to dive into to solving the problem, and we kept having to remind ourselves, well, let's not get let's at least figure out what are all the problems first, and then we'll go into solving them. So we're very grateful that a lot of this homework has been done, but we're going to focus on provider to provider, and here are the specific scenarios that were called out and captured during phase 1 work that I've taken and massaged a little bit. So I'll be honest, I've taken a lot of liberty working with Russell and John and the co-chairs to pull this together, but thinking about it from a scenario perspective. And I'm not going to read all these to you because then we wouldn't be covering all this in an hour. I want to make sure there's time for your input as well. But thinking about it from an HIE transformation, there's a scenario listed under there that talks about, patient has a medication that originally came from data ingested from an external system. It was listed in their treatment plan. The physician's treating the patient, but wants to know if the prescriber was a specialist or was it the patient's original primary care provider. So that's an example of who was it that recorded that medication to begin with, because sometimes that is helpful based on input we got from the clinicians. And you'll see that that's kind of how it falls all the way through. So looking at it from an EHR or HIE transformation perspective under provider to provider, there's a couple of scenarios. So kind of talking about it from a real world experience. If you create a patient summary, how are you going to incorporate the content from multiple encounters and authors into your information? How are you going to pull that in? So there's some synergies there. Again, the clinician information reconciliation and incorporation, we're going to hopefully take the information from that HL7 guide to help address and provide information around these scenarios. And then last but not least, an individual, a consumer, you and I, who want to correct something, or a provider who wants to correct something. Now, up front, and to be transparent, we've decided to take the consumer piece of correction off the table as being not in scope for this implementation guide, because we don't think that there's good enough standards to be able to really point to something technically implementable just yet. Not to say it can't be in the next generation of an IG, and we do expect that our implementation guides that we draft will be various versions. So this will be version 1, and put out another version, within another year to 18 months. So it'll be something that we have a continuous improvement and innovation roadmap for data usability, hopefully. But thinking about it from a provider correcting the data because maybe it was entered wrong or somebody fat-fingered something, or you want to retain, the original prescriber for a medication, because it may be helpful to know the original prescription for this insulin for this patient was provided by their provider, their primary care provider, 18 years ago or something to that effect. So next slide, please. And we kind of followed along the same thing for each of the main overreaching use cases. So provider to public health agency. We really want to focus on provenance data for immunization specifically, especially with everything that's gone on with COVID this year. It's brought to light that you really need to have some more guidance on immunizations so that they can be found in the same places. So one of the big problems that have been documented is that we need to provide section guidance so that everybody documents immunizations a little bit more uniformly. So that they distinguish, administered vaccines from historical vaccines so that it's something like my medical record, for instance. I've been catching up on all my medical stuff I put off last year because of COVID. So I've been to the dermatologist and to my regular primary care provider. But I've noticed that it's funny, wherever they've captured influenza, my flu vaccine from last year, it's in different places in my own document that I download from each of my providers. When I did get my COVID vaccine, those things are showing up in different places sometimes. So making sure that some of that can be found easily. But the original administration is the most valuable. Who was the original and what date for when it was originally administered. Not just that you've had it, but some of the additional data. And then one of the things that came up as a question, and this is a question for you to ponder as well, should there be consideration be made for electronic case reporting and the types of transactions there? I know that there's actually been an uptake of electronic case reporting by the eHealth Exchange Network and by Care Quality with guidance for how to do that. So is there any improvements we can make there? So we're going to be doing some investigation on that. So that's kind of the scope of the use cases for provenance. So next slide, please. And then the last one is the healthcare entity to consumer. So this breaks down into 3 overreaching scenarios, which are kind of spelled out. There's more detail behind all these summarized slides in those Word documents that are Google documents. So you can see all the notes and comments that we had from all the workgroup members over the past several months there. What we've tried to do is pull all that data out into these slides so that we can kind of socialize it so that you can hear it all at one time. And then help us course correct, as I said, as we start drafting the guide. We don't have a drafted guide to show to you today, but we're going to take this information from these slides and all of the background data from the workshop, et cetera, and start incorporating and putting together the straw man. And we'll eventually review those on some of these calls as we move forward. But we wanted to at least give you kind of what I would call the Cliff Notes version of it. But the scenarios for this is digitally signing the data. Again, I mentioned earlier, one of the important pieces are that as a consumer-directed, health information exchange becomes more prevalent, there's thought that's being already put out by folks that there needs to be some kind of verification of the integrity to make sure that the patient-supplied medical information is from a trusted source, and that when electronic health information is obtained by a patient, that it is digitally signed. So, for instance, your COVID vaccination, it's been digitally signed by somebody so that you can verify it's not been altered by some third party. And the third party that receives it can have some confidence in the integrity of that data. So trying to spell those types of things out. And then consumer apps facilitating the submission of things for sports physicals. I mean, with COVID now, I hate to say it did change the world quite a bit, but immunizations are very much more important for travel. People are starting to talk about maybe even certain concerts, certain events, sporting events, the Olympics, for instance, things like that, making sure that as apps drive the patient-driven data coordination, that consumers are going to demand data access for this, but we need to make sure that there's a chain of trust that's maintained. And then the last bullet point, in enabling a patient to request corrections. We did address that we identified that HL7 does have a patient empowerment work group that's starting to address this. They actually formed their work group just last fall for the first time. It's a new work group within HL7, and they're hoping to help address some of this patient correction use case information. But really, right now, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for that to be done electronically in any way. So they'll have to continue kind of focusing on, calling their provider. But the patient should provide an initial trigger to identify something. Because me as a patient, I know, and I use this example several times. I had a lab test done by an external lab from my provider. This has been about 10 years ago. And they had my date of birth wrong. So when it came back into my record, the date of birth was wrong for me. And, of course, it's in my record, so it got imported that way, but it could cause patient matching problems down the road somewhere along the way if somebody wanted to look at that one lab result from that thing 10 years ago. Probably won't be a case, but you know what? I could not change it because when I went to a provider and identified it, and this was within a month after I got the result, my provider said, well, that's an external lab. I have no control over their data. And they weren't even going to try to have them correct the data. So those are the kind of things that I know we're going to run into more and more, and we need to start thinking about how and if the electronic workflows of the data moving and the sources of truth. How are they alerted on those kinds of things? I don't think we're there yet to be able to do that. So that third scenario probably won't be addressed, although we will continue keeping it as a placeholder. So I'm not going to say that it won't be addressed forever. It just probably won't be addressed on this first go round unless we find something magical that we can point to for low-hanging fruit. Next slide, please. And the collaboration space. So this is where I wanted to kind of point out that for this specific data provenance and traceability of changes topic, we did receive these two inputs. We're going to be looking through this, and we may be reaching out to both Andrea and Ricky. I don't see either one of them on the call right now, but we will be working with them to see if we want to leverage, for instance, I'll be honest, I didn't realize that the CLIA standard test report had some provenance information implications.
Yes. Sorry, this is Andrea. I'm on the call listening.
There you are. You're caller number 4. You're caller number 4.
But yeah, and same thing for the lab result. I wasn't gonna speak up because I'm driving, but the lab result change, I would recommend that you reach out to the performing laboratory because they're the ones that can update and correct anything in a report according to CLIA regs, which requires the original, what was changed from to what it was changed to as part of that provenance, kind of what you guys are calling provenance. There's a lot more regulations in CLIA.
Interesting. Well, that's something again, you taught me something new. So I think that's what this work group is, that's what I'm hoping we'll do, is we can all share our knowledge and combine our brains and come up with something that's good. But we will definitely be investigating that more. And we may reach out to you to ask any questions. So John and Russell and myself will do that. And then again, Ricky added on with additional information, what data is important depends on the use case, which, as you saw, so our use cases are multidimensional. There's the overreaching, provider to provider, provider public health, and healthcare entity to the consumer, but then there's those scenarios underneath that are EHR or HIE, and then we're also looking at what usability. Is it a person? Is it interaction with machine? Is it what type of usability are we trying to improve? So we're going to try to look at it from all those different lenses with the input. But again, this is an example using the collaboration space and giving kudos to those two ladies that actually provided this input. We want more of this. So please, if any of these are in your wheelhouse as you go out to those topic categories, we are still looking for any input, and we'll continue taking input till a certain time, probably October, because there'll be a point of no return. There'll be a point where we can't just incorporate something brand new, but probably by late September, October 1st timeframe, we'll stop taking any collaboration space input and really spend, some of those meetings fleshing out, making sure that in between cycles you guys review things. We'll be creating the implementation guide draft into a Google document, so we'll be able to entertain comments being put directly in that document and so forth. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So really kind of wrapping it up, the whole development process for our Phase 2 implementation guide is kind of outlined here in this slide. So summarizing it, again, the co-chairs, the staff, we've, as you see based on these slides, we've started to organize and gather the content from all the different sources for each of the 8 topic categories. We started on only one because we wanted to kind of throw it out there, see if there's any other opportunities for anyone to suggest improvements or anything that you would like to be more transparent. But we're going to try to socialize this type of information, but in between the meetings, trying to also have you guys do homework. So my expectation is that we'll hopefully pull some of this data into the guide before our next meeting, which we will have to talk about. Our next meeting happens to fall the same week HIMSS falls. So our next meeting is actually scheduled for August the 12th, and HIMSS actually goes the 9th through the 13th. So I will ask for maybe either a raise of hands or maybe put in the chat window, are you going to be at HIMSS? Will you be missing the call? Because we may either need to reschedule that call, which is my recommendation, because I don't think we want to cancel it. We only have 4 more meetings, if you think about it, before November. So, and that's counting the August one. So that's something that we will ask you about here in just a few moments. But that's kind of the highlight. We're going to gather the information, document it in the Google documents. So we've tried to provide you links. So I've already put them in the chat window, but the priority work item spreadsheet is linked here. We'll take John and Russell are both working on also taking a high-level pass through the existing recommendations from the Commonwealth Care Quality Joint Document Content Workgroup Implementation Guide. Because some of these things have some guidance there that have just never been raised to be very visible. So we may link to it and say, hey, you need to also include this as part of your guidance. We don't want to necessarily re-document it in the same place and duplicate it, but we definitely want to leverage work that's already been done by other folks and groups such as Care Quality and Commonwealth. We'll integrate the feedback from the workshops. As you've seen here, we've taken and at least pulled out the main things that we heard from the workshop over and over again. Incorporating the feedback from the collaboration space, which you've already seen how we're going to be taking some of the information that Andrea and Ricky have provided, and then going over the problem statements with a real, more of a technical lens on it, so that we can make sure that it's technically implementable, so that if we do testing against it, we have some way of saying this shall do this way, or it should, so that we'll know if there's errors and warnings, and making sure that from a technical perspective, we also give the breadcrumbs to the standards so that there's clear understanding by industry. But then also documenting any other aspects that may need to be considered for best practices. And then we'll do this for each of these topic areas. We've only done the first one. We have 7 more to go. My goal is to do 2 per month. I don't know if we're going to keep that cadence through the whole summer, but I'm hoping the next few meetings we'll do a couple per month, and then that will leave us the last meeting or 2 leading into January. So the goal is to put out a draft IG for public comment by January, but have it formally reviewed and adopted by our work group by the end of December. So with that, if you'll go to the very last slide, this actually gives you the information on the work group. So the website link for more information is here. Phone number if you want to call somebody to talk with us. The email so that we can have multiple staff monitoring that, and we can make sure to route any questions or comments that need to be considered and so forth, pulling this together. So that's kind of a summary. I wanted, and good, we have about 20 minutes left. With this now, I want to open it up for discussions, for questions from the work group members about this specific topic focus anyway. And David and John and Brian, or John and Russell, sorry, please, I know I've done all the talking, so I also invite you to add your thoughts and input.
Thanks, Dee Dee. It's really comprehensive. So, I just want to say that, it's, I think we've really started to flesh out, the stuff from phase 1 and put it into some really defined, problem statement with use case scenarios so that we can come up with the IGs, and we really appreciate everyone's input. But as we've said before, and particularly as we were both, we were all doing the brainstorming in the first part, there's so much overlap here in common themes that were becoming intertwined, and provenance really kept coming up. And we know there's already a lot of guidance and things, but how do we, just to keep the focus on those pain points with those use cases? What's everyone's thoughts about what we've done so far, and in terms of what we've put out there, to come up with the IG, at least for this topic. That way we can, or this couple topics, so that we can use that as our template moving forward.
Yeah, this is our plan of attack, and I think we've got lots of data sources. Now it's just a matter of putting it into some sort of IG that's clear and non-ambiguous. So we got our work cut out ahead for us. But we have a great team, and I'm looking forward to getting more input from others as well.
So this is Gary Dickinson. I think the input from the clinicians was very good, very important, obviously, because they end up being the target or the end delivery point for much of what we're talking about. And, you know, whether data is usable when it gets to them. And in this case, we're talking about provenance, traceability, some of those kinds of things. But it seems like our implementation guide is probably not so much oriented to them, because whatever is implemented is kind of handed to them at that point. So I'm assuming our implementation guide is really oriented toward the system designer developer who is going to ensure that the proper information is captured at the source, at the point of origination, and then transmitted, if appropriate, from that source environment, that source system, to potentially an intermediary such as an HIN, and that the implementer perspective for the HIN is at least a different group of people. And so the implementation guide must also be oriented to what is the HIN's responsibility, assuming that the source system captured all the right stuff appropriately, retained it appropriately in their data store, and then when they went to exchange it, they properly populated the exchange artifact, be it a message, a document, or a resource, such that the intermediary can capture it and retain it or exchange it from that point on. And then the receiver has a certain set of responsibilities in terms of ensuring that information is also captured through that exchange artifact, and then properly captured into their data store, and then ultimately presented to the ultimate end user, or for the purpose of the end use. And so it seems like there's multiple stages along the way, and that potentially we're talking to multiple different implementers, different audiences,
right.
Different people.
Amelia, can you go back to slide number 11, please? Yeah. So Gary, you're hitting the nail on the head. That's exactly what we're planning on doing. Now, one thing I didn't share, I was remiss in saying, because we did bring it up in discussion with Russell and John earlier this week as well. We were also thinking about coming up with an appendix so that if you're interested in public health, because remember, this is going to be an IG that's covering 8 different topics with all these different lenses. So if you look at just provider to provider for this one topic category, we've got 4 different types of stakeholders, and then there's scenarios under each of them. So HIE transformation, we're specifically going to try to address that scenario of a patient has a medication. So we're only focusing on medication here that originally came from data ingested from an external system listed in their treatment plan. We may find that that same guidance could be used for other pieces of data, but we're going to start with medication because that's what the clinician said was most important to help them with medication reconciliation and things like that. So I don't want to do too much scope creep, and I know that's just a tiny baby step, but it's at least a baby step forward for that's very critical. And then you'll see under the EHR and quote HIE transformation, we're going to try to address, the creation of a patient summary, incorporating the content from multiple different encounters with lots of different authors, because as you start entering into the FHIR world, remember this guide isn't going to just focus on CDA. It's going to also focus on FHIR if appropriate. If the fire resource and bundles are mature enough, or at least in a normative state enough to actually focus on. And I think that's why medication is one of those 18 data classes that USCDI is really trying to hone in on. So we're going to try to leverage some of that. So I hope that helps, but if you look under the EHR-HIE transformation, the second scenario is the EHR creates a patient summary document. So putting it from a perspective of you're an HIE vendor and here's the gotchas you have to think about, and here's an EHR vendor. So it's the same type of scenario of transformation for provider to provider, because data goes across all these multiple hops, to your point. Right. We're going to try to figure out how to put it in some way, and we definitely will value your input as we start drafting this. We may find that we can improve it further, but we are trying to figure out how we're going to be able to document it from all these different perspectives. Does that help?
Well, sure. And basically what we're describing, of course, is that chain of trust from source to use.
Absolutely.
But recognizing that if data is actually transformed and turns out to have different content than the previous hop, then in fact that's a new provenance event, because data has now been introduced that is not the same as what was originated. So you have the provenance of the original source, and then you have provenance that may occur at the point of a creation of a patient summary or other transformation points in that chain of trust. And this is where things get really complicated and where people start throwing up their hands and saying, well, we just can't possibly handle all of that. But yet, if the systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that information should at least be captured. How it finds its way downstream and how it might be represented to the ultimate end user is part of what we need to think about. But we want to be sure that that data is captured, the provenance data is captured at each of those critical points along that path.
Absolutely. And Amelia, if you go back 2 more slides to slide number 9, that's where, again, we're going to keep the principles from the clinician workshop that the must-have is that they expect to have where the data originated, what type of clinician, which is new, and the date. But then if you look at the 3rd bullet point, it says provenance of context for how it was captured and last touch are also nice to have. So we'll see what is possible. I won't say that we'll be able to solve it completely, but we're going to try our darndest to get as much information in there to address it using their guidance based on that. So all those things taken into account. So it may not be solving world hunger completely, but hopefully we'll be able to feed the troops.
Right. Because once that moment is passed, then the data is lost.
Exactly.
And so it's crucial to capture it, whether or not it gets propagated downstream and is ultimately available at every hop and every little nuance along the way. That's a different issue and a different challenge. But at least if the data, if our implementation guide says capture it, and at least we have that covered, and potentially could have an auditable continuity of the chain of trust that could be forensically followed, if not necessarily by the end user.
Yeah, we have a hook to follow the breadcrumb trail, so to speak. Absolutely.
Right.
And I just want to add in to what Gary's saying, because we worked quite a while ago on the EHRS receipt of lab results into the EHR, and with a lot of the clinicians, there was kind of eye-opener experience, if you will, because most all EHRs don't preserve the original laboratory result names or order names from the performing laboratories. There's some type of modification based on the terms they build in their EHR databases, and values and results and what people call metadata, which is really part of the full meaning of a laboratory test, like the specimen or unit, are often remapped to the internal database terms so that there's kind of a standardization across laboratories. And in this regard,
they can do the trending. Yeah, they'd probably do that for trending and other things,
right,
probably.
Right, but then there's information that gets lost because, and if you can imagine taking one single lab test result, like say a LabCorp test from, or Quest, they have 50% of the volume across the country for lab results. if you take a look at one, I'd be very interested in tracing that across all providers, practices, and EHR vendors and seeing how many permutations of that lab name description exist in all those downstream EHRs, HIEs, public health, etc. Because of this issue that introduces variety and variability in how this thing is represented across the country. And then you start exchanging it with an HIE, how will a provider know that this is actually the same test on that is done either on another patient or on the same patient at a different time from a different provider if it's described differently? You can't tell the
you're
name,
exactly
you
right.
can't tell
Yeah.
information of a lab test by its name alone. So I included that in the comments, but this is really important. And I don't think for Providence that this change is being captured. CLIA requires that the lab, there's a recording of the first downstream entity from the performing laboratory. So a lot of times they cap accreditation in that regard. And so, if an inspector comes, they can show what was received. But that was at the point of the HL7 message receipt into the EHR, like the doorstep. And before it even shows up to providers or other entities, that message is deconstructed, remapped internally, and then used for those displays and other outbound messages, to Gary's point. So, how much variability is introduced? I don't know.
Yeah. And again, we're going to try our best to do as much as we can, knowing, just putting expectations out there. What we put in this implementation guide, the expectation is that the industry, and who I mean by industry is people like Commonwealth, like Care Quality, like eHealth Exchange, like SureScripts, like Epic Care Everywhere, like Athena Health, and all of these different networks will start adopting it through their governance structures as necessary, chic, whoever, so that people will take the guidance as appropriate. In the implementation guide, we're going to try to put it so that if you're a public health official, here are the chapters and sections that are appropriate for you. So you don't have to read through the entire document. You've got kind of like a skinny version of hyperlinks that'll give you, here's where I can find this information specific for this. So we're going to try to find a way to have it, searchable by type of organization, whether you're an HIE, an EHR, whether you're public health or a provider or healthcare entity or a consumer. So we're going to try to figure out ways to also pull that out into either appendices or some sort of attachment that has that, breadcrumb trail listed. In other words, we've got to still figure that part out. But as we start drafting it, we would welcome, again, any suggestions for improvement as we go. But we've got a lot of work ahead of us. And unfortunately, we only have 5 more months this year. I don't know where the time has gone, but, here it is already, July. So anyway. Any other comments from folks? I know we're getting close on time.
Well, this is Gary again. I think there's a bit of a challenge in some cases where a particular clinical action is performed by a clinician and then recorded by somebody else. And so what does the provenance, the record entry that shows up in the system is actually authored by somebody other than the actual performer of the actions being documented. So we have to think about that.
Yeah, that's going to continue. Yeah, unfortunately, that I think will continue to be a problem because of an electronic system. It's whoever's logged in at that time, to your point, that's documenting it. So, my provider still enters her own data in her EHR for me, and I love that because I know she enters it directly. But I have another surgeon that I go visit, and he actually has somebody enter it in for him. So it's one of those things that I don't think there's a good way to fix that other than trying to, depending on what's needed for that chain of trust, figuring out how to digitally sign it in some way so that if somebody is collecting that data, it still has to be digitally signed by, to your point, the performer.
Well, that's ideal, certainly, but there may be a need then to look at the who, what, when, where, and why associated with the action as well as the documentation of that action, because oftentimes, for example, in code situations, data is collected on paper towels or whatever and entered later. And it may actually be the right person who did the thing that's entering it, but it's, offset by 15, 20 minutes, an hour or something later. And so there's some of those kind of challenges we have to think about as well.
Yeah, unfortunately that's the case. But I always remind folks it's still better than on paper, because on paper you don't capture any of that provenance very easily. Anybody can add something to paper later. Electronic systems hopefully will get better at it, but again, we won't be able to solve everything, but we're going to try our darndest to do as much as we can. Keeping in mind from a clinician perspective, we also may have other workshops. So one thing I didn't mention is we've had this workshop for clinicians. I think Debbie Condry, who's on our call, she helps facilitate under the Interoperability Matters cooperative, the Public Health and Emergency Preparedness Workgroup. So we are going to be working with that workgroup to get some input from a public health perspective on some of these things as well. So we're going to try to collaborate with other bodies. I know Debbie and I are also working with the Digital Bridge folks on things. There may be some guidance that we pull in for electronic case reporting there. So in other words, we're going to make sure we try to outreach to as many folks as possible based on who we already are interacting with. But if there are other opportunities such as those that I've just described that you think would be important, that's what Sequoia's, that's our main goal, is to convene and collaborate and try to pull together, interoperability improvements.
Hey, Dee, speaking of workshops, I thought I heard on a previous call that there was going to be a more detailed write-up from the provider workshop. Did I mishear that?
Well, see how this page that you're looking at here, this is the detail write-up for this topic area from that. You're going to see the same type of write-up for each topic area from that workshop.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
yeah.
This is one topic over that 90-minute workshop that we spent probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes on. So we're going to do this, but we're going to give it to you in spoonfuls. We're not going to try to do one big workshop write-up, because we don't have enough time and resources to do that. So we're going to do it per topic area, but you're going to see the same type of output, which is the full summary of the workshop and the main points that were made from all the clinicians for each of those. Does that make sense?
It does. I think so. I think you're saying this provenance topic slide we're looking at, that's the pattern that we should expect for other topics.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly. You're going to get the same type of, so these slides, in other words, all of this pattern that you've just seen, we're going to try to give you this in spoonfuls. The next one will cover the next two topic categories. So we're going to try to take them in order of the Google spreadsheet. So provenance was the first one. So we're going to take the next two, hopefully, in the next meeting. So August will focus on the next two. And now that we're right up on time, I forgot to ask on that note, how many people are not, well, I don't know which is better, who are going or not going to HIMSS? I have 15 people on the line. I wish there was a raised hand like what Zoom has, but I don't think that we have anything like that. Can you guys let me know real quick, either in the chat or, in other words, I'm trying to figure out, should we move the meeting or will we still have at least a decent showing? I know I'm available for the meeting. Dr. Comita, would you be available? I know in your new role, by the way, Dr. Comita now works for Anthem Health. He just started this week, so congratulations on your new role there. Would you be available? I think I have to, check with you guys first.
Yes, I so far I'm not planning on going to him, so I should be available.
All right. Let me just go down the line. Tom, are you going? Tom Brunken? Jeff, are you going?
Jeff Hellman, no, I'm not going.
Hey, Marianne Berger, are you going to HIMSS?
No.
Amy McCormick, are you going to HIMSS?
Sorry for the double mute. No, I am not.
All right. Joe Lammy, are you going to HIMSS? Gary, are you going to HIMSS?
Not going to HIMSS, but I'll be on vacation.
Oh, okay. And then John and Ryan, or Ryan? I keep getting your name wrong, Russell. I am so sorry.
No worries.
John and Russell, are you guys going?
I don't believe John or I will be out.
All right, well, it sounds like all of us are available or not going, so we will continue to have the meeting. If we change that in any way, we will communicate it way ahead of time with an email push to you. But at this point in time, we will hold our next meeting in August, on August 12th. Thanks for staying just a few moments over. Any other parting comments, Dr. Comita, as we adjourn?
No, this is great. I really want to thank everybody for coming together and providing your input. And I think this is moving along. Really excited for the work. And please make your way to the collaboration forum and feel free to look at the questions and provide input. And we're really looking forward to discussing next time.
Well, with that, I thank you all for your time. Have a great rest of your day and week, and we will talk to you in a month. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.